The lawyer's hands trembled as he broke the red wax seal. It was June 17, 1854. Outside, the air over Natchez, Mississippi, hung heavy with heat, and cicadas droned like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Inside the parlor of Belmont Hall, however, the silence was absolute. 15 people sat there, watching Attorney Charles Whitfield unfold a document that would soon set fire to everything they thought they knew. They had gathered for what should have been a formal, predictable event, the reading of a planter's last will and testament. But within 4 minutes, that will would detonate like a cannon shot. In the center chair sat Margaret Langford, widow of the late Edward Langford, one of the richest cotton masters in Adams County. She wore black mourning silk and a veil that softened the hard lines of her face. Only 3 days had passed since she buried her husband of 23 years, yet she had already mastered the art of composed grief. Around her sat the family, 4 grown children, her sister, her brother-in-law, 2 attorneys, and several members of Natchez's social elite, summoned as witnesses to ensure that every legal formality was observed. They believed they were there to oversee the proper transfer of Belmont's fortune, 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, 50 enslaved workers, several businesses in town, and holdings valued at nearly $500,000. But as Whitfield adjusted his spectacles and began to read, none of them knew that Edward Langford had used his dying breath to destroy them all. Whitfield cleared his throat. This last will and testament of Edward James Langford was dictated to me on the 3rd and 4th days of May, in the year of our Lord 1854, and executed under his express instruction. Margaret's shoulders eased slightly. The preamble was familiar: declarations of sound mind, revocation of prior documents. Routine. Her eldest son, Samuel, 22, leaned back in his chair, already imagining how he'd run the plantation. Her daughters, Clara and Emily, exchanged relieved smiles. Their futures, their dowries, their marriages, all secure. But then Whitfield's voice wavered. To my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Langford, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid within 30 days of my death. For several seconds, no one moved. The air seemed to thicken. Margaret blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. $1. She whispered. There must be some mistake. Whitfield did not look up. Please allow me to continue. To my sons, Samuel Edward Langford and William Charles Langford, I leave the sum of $1 each. To my daughters, Clara Margaret and Emily Caroline, I leave the sum of $1 each. The room exploded with voices. Chairs scraped, someone gasped. Samuel rose to his feet, face flushing dark red. This is nonsense. Father had over $400,000 in assets. The plantation alone is worth. Sit down, Mr. Langford, Whitfield said sharply. His hands were trembling now. There remains the principal bequest. The silence that followed was so deep it felt alive. The kind of silence that presses on the chest, that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Whitfield's voice cracked slightly as he read the next line. To Eleanor Marie, a woman of approximately 32 years of age, presently held in bondage at Belmont Plantation, I hereby grant immediate and unconditional freedom. The words hung in the air like smoke. Someone gasped. Margaret's hand went to her throat. Whitfield went on. Furthermore, I grant to the aforementioned Eleanor Marie the entirety of Belmont Plantation, including all 3,100 acres of land, all buildings, equipment, livestock, and current and future crop yields. Margaret's chair toppled backward as she stood. No. No. This is forgery. Charles, you wrote this yourself. You're trying to steal, Mrs. Langford, Whitfield said softly. Your husband dictated this will to me personally 6 weeks before his death. I advised against these terms. He insisted. 6 weeks. Margaret's voice broke into a shriek. 6 weeks. He sat at my table, let me nurse him, let me pray over him, and he had already written me out of everything. Her daughters began to cry. William, the younger son, looked ill. But Samuel's voice cut through the chaos. Who, he said slowly, dangerously, is Eleanor Marie? No one answered. Because they all already knew. Whitfield lowered his eyes. There is more, he said quietly. I further declare that the following children currently residing at Belmont Plantation are my natural offspring, to be freed immediately and provided for from the estate. Matthew, age 9, Sarah, age 6, and Thomas, age 3. The room erupted again. Elizabeth fainted. Someone screamed. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth open but no sound emerging. Those children. Everyone at Belmont had seen them. Lighter skin, familiar eyes, features whispered about but never acknowledged. Now the truth was public, carved in ink and sealed in law. And then, from the doorway, came a voice. Calm, steady. I'm right here. Every head turned. Eleanor Marie stood in the entrance, wearing a plain grey dress. Her hair was pulled back, her posture straight, her face expressionless. She was 32 years old, born enslaved in Virginia, sold south at 14, purchased by Edward Langford in 1843 for what the records described as household management. For 11 years she had lived in a small room behind the kitchen, managing accounts, supervising servants, raising 3 children in silence, children everyone saw but no one named. Now she owned everything. Margaret stared at her, white-knuckled fury shaking her hands. You knew, she whispered. You knew he was going to do this. Eleanor's voice was quiet. He told me 3 days before he died. 3 days, Margaret repeated, her laugh brittle. He gave you 3 days warning and me none. 11 years in my house, eating my food, wearing my clothes, and this is your gratitude? You never gave me anything, Eleanor said softly. Your husband bought me. Everything I had, my body, my time, my children, belonged to him. To you. I wasn't free to refuse, or leave, or protect myself. I owed you nothing. The word property hung between them like poison. Samuel stepped forward, rage in his eyes. You dare talk to my mother? Whitfield moved between them. Mr. Langford, I advise you not to lay a hand on her. Miss Eleanor is a free woman as of 3 days ago. She has legal standing. Miss. Samuel spat. You call her miss? Yes, Whitfield said, his voice steady. By law and by right. Laughter erupted from one of the witnesses, hysterical, uncontrollable. Margaret sank into her chair, shaking. Why? She whispered. Why would he do this? What did you do to make him destroy his family? Eleanor's composure cracked at last. Beneath the surface calm was grief, the kind that sits in bones for years. I didn't make him do anything, she said. He chose. Every day for 11 years he chose. To come to my room. To father children he kept in chains. To live a lie that protected him and ruined everyone else. And when he was dying and could no longer pretend, he told the truth. That's all. The air in the parlor felt electric, alive with hatred, shame, disbelief. Margaret's brother-in-law, Thomas Langford, a lawyer himself, rose at last. This will is illegitimate, he declared. Extracted under duress from a dying man. It violates natural law and Christian morality. It will not stand in court. Whitfield met his gaze. It was properly executed. Edward Langford was of sound mind. He had every legal right to dispose of his property. She can't own property. Thomas roared. A freed Negro woman cannot own a plantation. The law forbids it. Your brother anticipated that argument, Whitfield said quietly. He created trust structures and guardianships to ensure legality. I don't care what legal tricks he used. Margaret cried. This is my home. My children's inheritance. I'll burn it to the ground before I let that woman take it. Eleanor met her eyes, calm again. Then burn it, she said. It will still be mine when the ashes cool. That single sentence marked the beginning of a war that would last 7 years. When the will reading ended, the parlor emptied in chaos, servants whispering, guests stumbling out into the hot afternoon light, the Langford family shattered. But in the quiet room behind the kitchen, Eleanor sat on her narrow bed, her 3 children huddled against her. Are we really free? Little Matthew asked. The paper says we are, Eleanor said softly. But we'll have to fight to make it true. And in that moment, she understood what Edwardsville had done. It hadn't simply given her property or freedom. It had painted a target on her back, and on her children's. By sundown, word had already spread through Natchez. At every parlor and tavern, people whispered about the Langford will, the white master who'd left everything to his enslaved mistress. It was the scandal of the decade. For the Langfords, it was the end of everything. For Eleanor, it was only the beginning. The days following the reading of Edward Langford's will were like a fever that gripped the town of Natchez. Rumours spread faster than the June heat, curling through parlours and taverns, whispered behind fans and over whiskey glasses. The story was too irresistible, a respected planter leaving his fortune to a woman he had once owned. By the end of the week, the scandal had reached New Orleans. By the next, it had reached New York. Newspapers printed bold headlines. Mississippi master leaves plantation to former slave. Ministers thundered from pulpits about the decay of Southern morality. The Langford name, once a symbol of wealth and respectability, had become a curse. Inside Belmont Hall, the air was heavier than ever. The shutters stayed closed, the servants moved in silence, and Margaret Langford sat in the master bedroom like a queen in exile. She hadn't left the estate since the reading. The blinds were drawn, the mirrors covered. Her brother-in-law, Thomas Langford, came every morning from town, bringing stacks of papers and letters from attorneys across the state. He always found her the same way, upright in her chair, dressed in black, her Bible open on her lap but unread. "They're saying this is the greatest disgrace ever to touch a Southern family," Thomas said one morning, pacing the room. "If we let this stand, Margaret, it will destroy not just your fortune, but your children's futures. You understand that?" Margaret didn't look at him. Her voice was flat. "Then we don't let it stand." That afternoon, Thomas Langford filed a petition in the Adams County Chancery Court. It declared Edward Langford's will invalid, unlawful, and contrary to the moral and statutory principles of the state of Mississippi. His arguments were threefold: that Edward Langford had not been of sound mind when he dictated the will, that the woman named in it, Eleanor Marie, had exercised undue influence over him, and most importantly, that Mississippi law did not permit a freed person of color to inherit such property or to hold ownership of enslaved people. It was a case designed to do more than win. It was meant to erase. Meanwhile, in a small law office near Pearl Street, Eleanor sat across from attorney Charles Whitfield. The same man who had read the will now found himself the defender of the most controversial woman in the South. "You understand what this means," Whitfield said quietly. "The Langford family intends to destroy you. They'll drag your name through the mud. They'll say you seduced him, poisoned him, trick him. They'll use every weapon they have." Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap. "They already have," she said softly. "For 11 years. Whitfield sighed. "I have drafted my response to the court. Well argue the will was executed lawfully, that Edward Langford was competent and deliberate in his choices, and that under existing statutes, freed persons can inherit property, though restricted in certain ways." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You need to understand, Miss Eleanor, this won't be a single hearing. It will be years. They'll appeal and appeal again. You'll be called names. Threatened. Possibly worse." Eleanor met his gaze. "I lived as property for 20 years, Mr. Whitfield. I know worse." The first hearing took place on August 4, 1854. In a courthouse so crowded the judge had to order the doors closed. People stood in the aisles, women fanning themselves, men leaning against the walls. Reporters scribbled furiously. The presiding judge, Honorable Nathaniel Foster, was a stern man in his 60s with a snow-white beard and a reputation for defending Southern order. He banged his gavel once, the sharp sound echoing off the high ceiling. "This court will hear the petition of Langford versus Whitfield et al. Concerning the validity of the last will and testament of Edward James Langford, deceased." Margaret was there, dressed in deep mourning, her children arranged beside her like ornaments of tragedy. Her son Samuel sat rigid, jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The younger daughter, Emily, cried silently behind her veil. On the other side of the room sat Eleanor. She wore a simple grey dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. She had been instructed to look humble, not defiant, not proud. To appear grateful for the freedom she had been given, even as she fought to keep it. To the spectators, the sight of her sitting opposite the Langfords was a kind of sacrilege. The idea that a black woman, once enslaved, could face a white widow as an equal in court was almost too much to bear. Thomas Langford stood first. His opening argument was a performance worthy of theatre. "Your Honour, this is not merely a question of inheritance. It is a question of civilization itself," he declared, his voice booming across the room. "If we permit this will to stand, we will open the floodgates to moral anarchy. Shall the property of respectable families be left to their former servants? Shall our sacred institutions be mocked by the whims of dying men corrupted by their basest impulses? Applause rippled from the gallery until the judge rapped his gavel for silence. Whitfield rose next, measured and deliberate. Your Honour, the question before this court is not one of morality but of law. Did Edward Langford, of sound mind and body, possess the legal right to dispose of his property as he chose? The evidence will show that he did. The law of Mississippi grants that right, even if society finds his choice distasteful. Foster regarded both men with equal suspicion. This matter is complex, he said finally. I will not issue a summary judgment. We will proceed to a full probate hearing. Both sides may present evidence and witnesses. The truth will be examined in full daylight. A murmur swept through the crowd. The case would go forward. That evening, back at Belmont, Margaret gathered her children in the master bedroom. The same room where Edward had once slept, where now only bitterness remained. She closed the door and made them stand in a circle around her. We will fight this with everything we have, she said. With money, with lawyers, with the truth itself if necessary. We will prove that woman manipulated your father, poisoned his mind, destroyed our family. Do you understand me? Her son Samuel nodded grimly. Yes, mother. Swear it, Margaret said. Swear to me you'll never rest until Belmont is ours again. They swore. And in that darkened room, the battle lines were drawn, mother against the dead man's conscience, children against their father's blood. In the weeks that followed, Natchez became a battlefield of words and reputations. Ministers took sides. Businessmen whispered about the precedent this might set. Some argued that Edward Langford's act was madness, others that it was divine justice. At the heart of it all, Eleanor tried simply to live. She stayed mostly in the quarters behind the old kitchen, caring for her 3 children. The townspeople avoided her. Some spat as she passed. Others stared with a kind of horrified curiosity. When she tried to buy cloth at a general store, the owner refused to serve her. I can't do business with you, Miss Eleanor, he muttered. My customers would never forgive me. The humiliation burned, but she said nothing. She turned and walked out, her children watching silently from the wagon. That night, 3 women from the small free black community in Natchez came to see her: Joanna Price, Mary and Grant, and Lydia Jones. Joanna, the eldest, spoke first. We heard what they did to you in town today. You're not alone, sister. We have merchants wholesale to us after dark, through the back door. We'll help however we can. Eleanor looked at her, overwhelmed. Why would you risk that for me? Joanna's voice was soft but firm. Because if you lose, we all lose. If the court says a colored woman can't own property, can't inherit, then none of us are safe. Your fight is ours now. For the first time since Edward's death, Eleanor felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear, something like courage. The full probate trial began on October 10th, 1854. The courtroom was even more crowded than before. Every bench was filled, the gallery packed, and the heat from so many bodies made the air stifling. Judge Foster entered with weary formality. This court will hear the testimony and evidence in the matter of the estate of Edward Langford. Counsel may proceed. Thomas Langford began by calling Margaret to the stand. She moved slowly, draped in mourning silk, every gesture calculated to evoke sympathy. Mrs. Langford, Thomas said gently, how long were you married to the deceased? 23 years, she replied, her voice trembling. And during those years, did you fulfill your duties as wife and mother? I did everything expected of me, she said. I bore him children, managed his home, supported his business. I was faithful, even when he was not. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Langford, Thomas continued, when did you first learn of his indiscretion? Margaret dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. When that woman bore a child in my house. I knew then. Everyone knew. But I endured it for the sake of my family. I prayed he would come to his senses. Instead, he rewarded my devotion with betrayal. The performance was perfect: grief, humiliation, righteousness. The 12 white men of the jury watched her with sympathetic eyes. When Whitfield rose to cross-examine, his tone was respectful. Mrs. Langford, you testified that you discovered your husband's relationship with Miss Eleanor 9 years ago. Did you ever confront him? Yes. And what was his response? That it was none of my concern. Did he ever deny the relationship? No. Did he ever promise to end it? No. Whitfield nodded slowly. So for 9 years you lived under the same roof, knowing this was happening, yet you chose to remain in the marriage? I had children to protect. Of course. But you understand, Mrs. Langford, that Miss Eleanor had no such choice. She could not leave. She could not refuse. She could not protect herself. You stayed because society required you to. She stayed because the law required her to. There is a difference. Thomas shot to his feet. Objection. Sustained, Judge Foster said quickly. But the point had been made. Over the following days, witness after witness took the stand. Servants, overseers, merchants, each painting their version of life at Belmont. Some described Eleanor as proud, insolent, manipulative. Others, when pressed by Whitfield, admitted she had been fair, intelligent, respected even among the enslaved. One elderly cook, Aunt Ruth, offered testimony that silenced the room. Did you observe the relationship between Mr. Langford and Miss Eleanor? Thomas asked. I saw what there was to see, she said. Would you say Miss Eleanor had influence over him? Aunt Ruth looked him square in the eye. You're asking if a woman owned by a man can influence the man who owns her? That don't make much sense, Mr. Thomas. Murmurs swept through the courtroom. She bore his children. Thomas said sharply. She bore his children because he came to her room, Aunt Ruth said. Because she couldn't say no. That's not influence. That's what happens when one person owns another. Judge Foster rapped his gavel, but the words had already landed. Then came the medical witness, Dr. Morrison, the family physician who had treated Edward in his final months. Doctor, Thomas said, what was the state of Mr. Langford's health? He suffered from consumption of the lungs. Advanced. He was very weak. Would you say his illness affected his mind? It is possible. Fever and exhaustion can cause delirium. Whitfield's cross-examination was surgical. Doctor, did you witness any confusion or irrationality? No. Did he recognize you? Discuss his affairs coherently? Yes. So your claim of mental impairment is speculation, not observation? Morrison hesitated. That's correct. The trial dragged on for weeks. Reporters wrote daily dispatches. The newspapers framed it as a moral war, virtue versus corruption, white purity versus black ambition. And through it all, Eleanor sat quietly, her face unreadable, as the world debated whether she was a woman or a symbol. But the turning point came in early November, when Charles Whitfield himself took the stand. He swore his oath, straightened his papers, and looked directly at the judge. Mr. Whitfield, Thomas began, I sent it true that you stand again financially from defending this will. I am compensated for my services, yes. But my duty is to my client's wishes. You claim my brother dictated this will to you. What proof do you have? Whitfield opened a leather-bound ledger. These are my notes, written in Edward's presence. He came to my office twice in early May. He was lucid, deliberate, and determined. He began to read. I know what people will think, Edward had said. That I was deceived. That I lost my senses. But they are wrong. I am not freeing Eleanor out of charity. I am acknowledging theft. I stole her life. I stole the childhood of my children. I built my wealth on their suffering, and I refused to die pretending it was righteous. The courtroom fell silent. He told me, Whitfield continued, that his wife would hate him, that his children would curse his memory, but he would rather die honestly than live another day a coward. Thomas was pale. My brother was delirious. No sane man would. Your brother was finally sane, Whitfield interrupted. For the first time in his life. The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Foster called for order. When the session ended that evening, Margaret left the courtroom without speaking. But as she passed Eleanor in the aisle, she stopped. You think you've won something, she said in a low voice. But all you've done is make sure everyone knows what you are. When this is over, you'll wish you'd taken the dollar and disappeared. Eleanor met her eyes calmly. When this is over, Mrs. Langford, your children will still have their name. Mine will have their freedom. I'll take that bargain. They never spoke again. As winter crept over Mississippi, the case paused for recess. The judge would deliberate over the holidays before issuing his ruling. But already, Lines had been drawn deeper than law could reach. Natchez society divided itself in two, those defending the sanctity of the Southern order, and those quietly daring to wonder if justice might, for once, belong to someone like Eleanor. Inside Belmont, the great house stood divided as well. Margaret occupied the east wing. Eleanor remained behind the kitchen. Two women living under one roof, separated by race, by history, by everything, and yet bound forever by the same man. And somewhere between them, the ghost of Edward Langford seemed to linger, whispering in every corner. What does it mean to make amends for a life built on sin? The trial was far from over. The real judgment had yet to come. Winter came early that year. Frost settled on the cotton fields around Belmont, a pale shroud over land still trembling from scandal. By December of 1854, the Langford case had grown beyond the borders of Mississippi. Newspapers from Richmond to Philadelphia printed editorials on what they called the most explosive will in the South. At its center were two women, one white, one black, each claiming the same man's legacy. One claimed her birthright, the other, her freedom. And between them stood a court forced to decide what justice meant in a world where justice had never been equal. For nearly 5 months, Judge Nathaniel Foster had heard every argument, every witness, every accusation. The courthouse in Natchez had become a theater of morality, law, and spectacle. And now, on the morning of December 12, 1854, the verdict was finally to be delivered. People began gathering before sunrise. Men in fine coats and women in fur shawls arrived by carriage from as far as Vicksburg. Reporters jockeyed for space along the walls. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, sweat, and anticipation. Eleanor sat beside Attorney Charles Whitfield in her same grey dress, hands folded, expression calm but eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Behind her sat members of Natchez's small free black community, those brave enough to be seen supporting her. Across the aisle, Margaret Langford looked carved from marble. Dressed in mourning silk trimmed with jet beads, she stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. Her children sat beside her, pale and solemn. Samuel, now the de facto head of the Langford family, had the hard stare of a man already imagining revenge. When Judge Foster entered, everyone rose. The gavel struck. Silence. This court, he began, has deliberated long and with the utmost gravity. The matter before us is not only of law but of conscience, a question that touches upon property, race, and the very fabric of our society. His voice echoed in the packed room. In rendering this decision, I am well aware that I shall displease all parties. But my duty is to the law as written, not as wished. He paused, unfolding a sheaf of papers. First, regarding the mental capacity of the deceased, Edward James Langford. The testimony of Dr. Morrison was speculative. The testimony of Mr. Whitfield, corroborated by written notes and a letter of intent, demonstrates that Mr. Langford was of sound and deliberate mind. The will, therefore, is valid in its formation. Margaret flinched as if struck. Second, the judge continued, the charge of undue influence. No evidence has been presented that Miss Eleanor Marie coerced or manipulated Mr. Langford. The relationship between them, while morally objectionable to many, does not constitute legal duress. The deceased acted of his own volition. Murmurs rose from the crowd. The gavel cracked again. Third, he said, we must address the central question. Whether Mississippi law permits a freed person of color to inherit and hold such property as this will describes. The air grew still. Even the spectators seemed to stop breathing. Foster looked directly at Eleanor. His expression was weary but not unkind. The statutes of this state restrict the rights of freed persons. They limit mobility, testimony, education, and association. But nowhere do they explicitly forbid ownership of property acquired through lawful means. The deceased exercised his right to manumit those he owned. That right is clear. What is less clear is whether he could transfer so vast an estate to a freed person. The law is ambiguous. He took a deep breath. Therefore, I am compelled to rule as follows. The will of Edward Langford is hereby recognized as valid, with modifications consistent with the spirit of Mississippi law. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Miss Eleanor Marie shall receive her freedom as stipulated. Her 3 children, Matthew, Sarah, and Thomas, shall also be freed. These provisions are lawful and immediate. Furthermore, she shall receive a portion of the Belmont estate, The North Tract, approximately 800 acres, along with all dwellings thereon, a trust fund of $50,000 in liquid assets, and her personal effects. Eleanor exhaled shakily, not yet understanding what that meant. The remainder of the estate, Foster went on, including the South Tract, urban properties, and business interests, shall revert to Mrs. Margaret Langford and her children under standard inheritance law. A gasp escaped Margaret's lips, half relief, half disbelief. But Foster wasn't finished. Additionally, the enslaved persons residing at Belmont shall be divided between the two estates. However, Miss Eleanor shall not own enslaved individuals, for such an arrangement would be morally untenable given her recent manumission. Those individuals shall be transferred or sold, and the proceeds divided accordingly. That sentence landed like a blade. Eleanor's stomach turned. The people she had lived beside for 11 years, people who had whispered her name in both envy and pity, would remain enslaved. Her freedom had come at their expense. Judge Foster's voice softened. This ruling, I hope, honors both justice and order. The court is adjourned. He struck the gavel. And the world erupted. Reporters stormed out to telegraph offices. Society ladies wept into handkerchiefs. Men argued in the aisles. Margaret's children crowded around her, crying and laughing at once. On the opposite side of the room, Eleanor sat very still, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Whitfield turned to her. Miss Eleanor, it's over. You're free. Your children are free. You have land, money. She shook her head slowly. Not all of them are free. He hesitated. We can appeal for the rest. We might win more. No, she said quietly. No more fighting. I've fought enough. Across the aisle, Margaret rose unsteadily to her feet. She caught Eleanor's eye for the briefest moment. Something passed between them, not forgiveness, not even hatred, but a shared exhaustion too deep for words. Both women understood the same truth. The man they'd loved in different ways had destroyed them both. Outside, the courthouse steps boiled with humanity. White citizens shouted, outrage, and treason of the law, while a smaller crowd of freed blacks watched in cautious silence. Reporters cornered Whitfield, shouting questions. Is your client satisfied? Will she remain in Natchez? Does she intend to manage the plantation herself? Whitfield only said, Miss Eleanor desires peace. But peace would not come easily. That night, the Langfords held what polite society called a family supper, though no one ate much. Thomas Langford, red-eyed and furious, slammed his fist on the table. We appeal to the Supreme Court. This cannot stand. Margaret looked at him across the candlelight. No, she said softly. Thomas blinked. No. Margaret, the ruling gives her land, money, and gives us something too, she interrupted. Enough to survive. Enough to rebuild. Enough to stop fighting over a corpse. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. For all his bluster, even he could not deny the truth. The fight had consumed them all. Samuel wasn't satisfied. You're giving up. He spat. After everything father did, your father is dead, Margaret said sharply. And am done living in his shadow. Her words silenced the table. Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to Belmont under cover of night. The moon hung low, pale as bone over the fields. The great house loomed ahead, half hers now, half the enemy's. When she entered the kitchen quarters, the servants fell silent. Some bowed their heads respectfully. Others turned away. For the first time in her life, they didn't know whether to call her Miss or Trader. In her small room behind the kitchen, her children were waiting. Matthew ran to her, clutching her skirt. Mama, are we free? She knelt down, holding him close. Yes, baby. We're free. Sarah's eyes were wide. What about the others? Eleanor swallowed hard. Not yet. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring out the window toward the fields. The wind whispered through the cane brakes, carrying faint voices, laughter, crying, songs of people who didn't yet know they'd been divided like livestock. Freedom, she realized, was not a clean thing. It was jagged and cruel, built on compromises that left scars. In the following weeks, the ruling rippled through Mississippi like a storm. Abolitionist papers in the North hailed it as progress. Southern editors condemned it as heresy. The Natchez Courier wrote, While this decision grants partial freedom to a Negro woman, it safeguards our institutions by preventing her from assuming control over white labor. Justice and propriety are thus preserved. But for Eleanor, there was no justice, only survival. Whitfield helped her establish the trust account and secure title to the North Tract. He introduced her to a banker willing to act as guardian, Harrison Wells, one of the few white men in Natchez who showed her respect. "You'll need intermediaries," he explained. "Merchants won't sell directly to you. But if I handle the transactions, no one will ask questions." Eleanor agreed. Pride had no value if her children went hungry. By March of 1855, she officially took possession of her land, 800 acres of rolling fields, a modest house, and a future that frightened her almost as much as it freed her. The division of Belmont's enslaved people took place a week later. It was a spectacle both obscene and ordinary, a tally of human lives turned into property lines and account ledgers. Families were split. Mothers wept. Men cursed under their breath. Eleanor stood in the yard, tears burning behind her eyes. She wasn't permitted to intervene. Legally, she no longer owned these people. She was allowed to keep only her children and a handful of servants who had volunteered to follow her to the North Tract. When an overseer read out the names, one man, Samuel, a field hand who had known Eleanor since her first year at Belmont, looked at her and said quietly, "Miss Eleanor, you crying for us?" She nodded. He gave a sad smile. "Least someone is." He was sold 2 days later to a plantation in Louisiana. Spring came. The North Tract bloomed with life again. Matthew and Sarah helped plant a small kitchen garden. Thomas, barely 5, chased butterflies in the grass. For the first time, Eleanor owned the soil beneath her feet. Yet she felt no peace. The house was too quiet, the silence too deep. Every night, she walked to the edge of her land where it met the South Tract. In the distance, she could see the lights of the Langford home flickering like watchfires. Sometimes she thought she saw Margaret standing on the balcony, looking back. 2 women, each guarding a piece of the same ghost. By summer, both families settled into uneasy coexistence. The boundary line between their properties became an invisible wall. They shared no words, no visits, not even hostility. Just silence. But Natchez society refused to let the scandal die. Everywhere Eleanor went, whispers followed. "That's her. The mulatto who inherited Belmont. The one who ruined the Langfords." Merchants continued to deny her credit. Preachers avoided her pew. Even some in the free black community grew distant, wary of the attention her case had brought. Isolation became her constant companion. One evening, Whitfield visited. He found her sitting on the porch, watching the sunset burn across the fields. "You've built something remarkable here," he said quietly. "You should be proud." She didn't look at him. "Am I supposed to be proud of winning half a chain?" Whitfield hesitated. "Freedom isn't perfect, Miss Eleanor. But it's a beginning." She turned to him, her eyes tired. "I was property for 20 years. Then a scandal. Now a symbol. When do I get to just be a person?" Whitfield had no answer. Across the boundary, Margaret's life was unraveling in its own quiet way. The Langford name, once revered, had become a whisper of scandal. Invitations ceased. Business partners withdrew. Her eldest son, Samuel, grew bitter, drinking heavily. Her daughters struggled to find suitors willing to risk association with the family. The fortune that remained began to shrink. One night, she found herself alone in the parlor, staring at Edward's portrait above the fireplace. The face that had once filled her with devotion now filled her with rage. "You destroyed us," she whispered. "And for what? To ease your guilt?" She held a glass at the painting. It shattered, splattering red wine across Edward's painted smile. In April 1855, the final paperwork arrived. The estate of Edward Langford was officially closed. The court declared all matters settled. Eleanor signed the documents with a hand that no longer trembled. Margaret signed hers too, lips pressed thin. They didn't speak. When they stood, Whitfield turned to both women. "You are, in the eyes of the law, no longer bound." But they both knew the law couldn't untangle what the past had woven. Years later, people would remember that courtroom day as a turning point, a crack in the edifice of the Old South. But for those who lived it, it was something smaller and sadder. The end of a war that left no victors, only survivors. Eleanor had won her freedom and her children's future, but she had lost her community. Margaret had salvaged her inheritance, but lost her family's name. Both women carried the ghost of Edward Langford like a shadow that would never fade. And somewhere beneath the soil of Belmont, the North and South tracks alike, the roots of that broken legacy continued to grow, tangled and unresolvable. For in a world built on ownership, even freedom carried a cost. The spring of 1856 came warm and early to Mississippi. The magnolias bloomed along the road to Belmont, heavy with scent, their blossoms white as ghosts against the green. To a passerby, it might have seemed that peace had returned to the Langford lands. The fields were planted again, wagons moved along the dusty tracks, and life appeared to go on. But under that calm, everything had changed. The old order that once ruled Belmont had split like a tree struck by lightning. The two halves of the plantation, North and South, stood side by side, bound by blood and history but divided by silence. On the South Tract, Margaret Langford still held court. The grand house remained hers, but it had lost its grandeur. The mirrors were spotted, the wallpaper fading. The family portraits stared down like silent judges. Servants still addressed her as madam, but there was no respect in their eyes anymore, only weariness. Her children had grown restless. Samuel, 23, spent his nights drinking in Natchez taverns, his temper quick to violence. Clara had withdrawn into the house, pale and quiet, avoiding the gossip that followed their name. Emily, the youngest, had begun to speak openly of leaving Mississippi altogether. And every evening, as the sun went down, Margaret walked to the porch with a glass of bourbon and stared north, toward the faint line of trees that marked the border of Eleanor Marie's land. She had never spoken to Eleanor since the day of the verdict. But she could not stop thinking about her. The knowledge that the woman her husband had once owned now lived, worked, and breathed as a free mistress on neighboring soil filled her with a mixture of fury and envy so potent it bordered on madness. On the North Tract, life was quieter but no less heavy. Eleanor's house was smaller, simpler, 2 stories of whitewashed wood surrounded by fields she could scarcely afford to cultivate. Most of her labourers had fled or been sold. The few who remained worked for wages, but even freedom had its price. The crops grew slowly. The money from the trust was enough to sustain them but not enough to build wealth. Still, there was dignity here, a fragile, hard-won dignity that Eleanor protected like a flame in the wind. Her eldest, Matthew, was now 10 and already taller than his mother's shoulder. He spent his mornings studying under a tutor Whitfield had found, a Quaker woman named Mrs. Reeves, who'd come south to teach freed children in secret. Sarah, 8, read by candlelight and dreamed of becoming a teacher herself. Little Thomas, only 5, chased the chickens and laughed in the sunlight, too young to understand the weight of their history. For the first time, they had a home that belonged to them. Yet even here, freedom came wrapped in fear. Sometimes, late at night, Eleanor would hear hoofbeats on the road. Men riding past, drunk, shouting slurs into the dark. Once, a stone shattered her window. Another time, someone nailed a dead crow to her gatepost. Each act was a message. You don't belong here. She told no one. She couldn't afford to show fear. In Natchez, society tried to forget the Langford scandal. But forgetting proved impossible. The case had exposed too much, not only about one family but about the hypocrisy woven into the fabric of the South. Ministers who'd preached purity now whispered about the illegitimate children hidden in their own parishes. Planters who'd condemned Edward Langford knew they'd done no better, only more discreetly. At dinner tables, people lowered their voices when the name Eleanor Marie was mentioned. Some called her a temptress, others, a thief. But there were a few, very few, who called her something else. A mirror. Because what she represented terrified them. She was proof that their world was a lie, that the boundaries they clung to could crumble with the stroke of a pen. By 1857, Eleanor's children had grown accustomed to isolation. Matthew, sharp and curious, began to question everything. "Mama," he asked one afternoon, "why do they hate us?" Eleanor paused from her sewing. "Because we remind them of something they don't want to see." "What's that?" "That the people they own are just like them." He frowned. "Then why don't they stop pretending?" She smiled sadly. "Because pretending is easier than changing." That night, she found him reading by candlelight, one of the books Whitfield had brought from town. It was a collection of abolitionist essays, illegal in Mississippi. You shouldn't have that, she whispered. I want to know why they think freedom is dangerous. It's not dangerous, she said. It's just expensive. It costs everything. In the spring of 1858, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Charles Whitfield arrived at the North Tract in a fine carriage, older now, greyer, but still carrying that steady gentleness she'd come to trust. I thought you might want to see this, he said, handing her a folded newspaper. It was from Philadelphia. The headline read, Mississippi woman freed and prosperous. A new dawn in the South? Eleanor's hands trembled. How did they get my name? It's been 5 years since the trial. Your story has become something of a symbol in the North, proof that progress is possible. They call you the Woman of Belmont. Eleanor folded the paper slowly. A symbol, she said bitterly. They make statues out of symbols, Mr. Whitfield. They don't ask if they're tired or lonely or still afraid. He nodded. Perhaps not. But symbols change things. Not here, she said. Not yet. Across the border, the Langford family was unraveling. Samuel's debts mounted. He gambled away half of what remained of the South Tract, mortgaging fields to pay tavern bills. Clara fell ill with fever and never fully recovered. Emily married a merchant from Vicksburg, desperate to escape the stain on her name. Margaret, meanwhile, withdrew from society entirely. She stopped attending church, stopped entertaining guests. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she'd found religion. The truth was simpler. She was haunted. Each night, she heard Edward's voice in the creak of the floorboards, in the sigh of the wind through the cottonwood trees. She drank to silence him, but he always returned. One stormy evening, she found herself standing in the parlor before his portrait again. Rain lashed the windows. Lightning flickered across his painted face. You think you did something noble, she whispered. You think freeing her made you clean. But you damned us all. A gust of wind burst through the shutters, knocking over a candle. The flame caught the edge of the portrait, curling it black. Margaret didn't move. She watched it burn. By 1859, the country itself had begun to tremble. Talk of secession spread like wildfire. Natchez newspapers filled with arguments about states' rights, tariffs, and slavery. But to Eleanor, it all felt distant, the noise of men debating the morality of what she had lived through. Her only concern was her children. Matthew, now 13, had grown serious, his boyish laughter replaced by thoughtfulness. He read newspapers aloud at breakfast, analyzing every word. Sarah sang hymns while she cooked, her voice a small rebellion against despair. Thomas, only 9, followed his mother everywhere, asking endless questions. Will they ever come for us again, Mama? He asked one night as thunder rolled outside. Eleanor brushed his hair gently. Maybe. But if they do, we'll still be together. That's what matters. She didn't tell him about the men who still rode past sometimes, shouting slurs. She didn't tell him about the note someone had left on her gatepost. You may be free, but you'll never be equal. She burned that note in the hearth. In the summer of 1860, Whitfield visited once more. He was older, slower now, his health failing. They're talking about war, he said gravely as they sat on the porch. If it comes, it will destroy everything, North and South alike. Eleanor stared out at the fields. Maybe that's what it takes to start over. War isn't rebirth, he said softly. It's fire. It burns the innocent and the guilty together. She nodded. But maybe the fire is the only thing that can cleanse what's rotten. He looked at her for a long moment. You sound like him, he said quietly. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Don't say that. I mean it kindly, he said. Edward saw what was coming. He just didn't live long enough to stop it. She turned away. Edward saw everything except the people he hurt. Whitfield didn't argue. He knew better than to defend the dead. Then came 1861. The first shots at Fort Sumter, the first cries of war. Mississippi seceded. The Confederacy was born. Both sides of Belmont changed overnight. Samuel Langford enlisted in the Confederate Army, swearing to defend the honor of the South. Margaret wept when he left, clutching the last clean handkerchief embroidered with the family crest. Across the line, Matthew Langford, though half white by blood, he would never be seen as anything but black, watched him ride away from the shadows of the oak trees. 2 sons of the same father, riding toward opposite futures. Within months, Union troops marched through Natchez. The city surrendered without a fight, but fear filled every street. Confederate sympathizers whispered about spies and traitors. Freedmen whispered about freedom finally coming true. By 1863, the war had reached Belmont. Union soldiers requisitioned supplies from both tracts. The Langford mansion was searched. Margaret nearly fainted when officers tramped across her marble floors. On the North Tract, Eleanor offered the soldiers water and food. Many were abolitionists from the North who had heard of her story. They treated her with cautious respect, some even admiration. When one of them asked if Shed Harbor escaped slaves, she answered simply, "I know what it is to run." She hid 3 men in her cellar that winter. The war devoured everything. Cotton prices collapsed. Plantations rotted in neglect. Men died by the thousands. And in the chaos, Matthew found purpose. At 16, he joined the United States Colored Troops, lying about his age to enlist. Eleanor begged him not to go. "You've fought enough," she said. "We've all fought enough." But he only smiled. "You fought for us, Mama. Let me fight for you." When he rode away in his blue uniform, Eleanor stood in the doorway until he vanished from sight. The war dragged on. The South bled. And in 1864, word came that Samuel Langford had fallen in battle near Atlanta. When Margaret received the telegram, she didn't scream or faint. She simply folded the paper, placed it on Edward's desk, and whispered, "Now we're even." She never recovered from that loss. Eleanor, too, feared the worst for months, until a letter arrived, carried by a soldier returning from the front. It was from Matthew. "Mama, I'm alive. We've taken Vicksburg. I've seen what freedom looks like when men fight for it, not beg for it. You told me freedom was expensive. You were right. But it's worth every drop we pay." Eleanor read the letter a dozen times until the ink began to fade. By the spring of 1865, the war was over. The Confederacy had collapsed. Slavery was dead, at least on paper. Eleanor's land survived, barely. The North Tract stood intact, though the fields lay fallow. When the first Union officer rode up with papers declaring all enslaved people free, Eleanor signed them with trembling hands. She looked across the property line at the South Tract, where Margaret stood on her porch, staring blankly at the ruins of a world. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. They had both outlived the man who bound them. They had both paid the price for his sins. In 1866, Matthew returned home, thin and weary, a scar running along his cheek. He wore his Union uniform proudly. Eleanor wept when she saw him. Sarah had grown into a quiet, strong young woman. Thomas was now 12, already dreaming of the North, of education, of something beyond Mississippi's ghosts. That summer, the family began rebuilding the fields. They hired freedmen at fair wages, taught them to read, shared food and tools. Slowly, painfully, the North Tract came alive again. Sometimes, at dusk, Eleanor would see Margaret walking along the distant road. Their paths never crossed, but once, just once, Margaret raised a hand in acknowledgement. Eleanor hesitated, then lifted her own. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was peace, fragile, human peace, after so many years of silence. Eleanor lived another 23 years. She saw Sarah marry a minister, Thomas study law, and Matthew become a teacher, opening a small school for freed children on the very land his father had once ruled. Margaret died in 1871, alone, buried beside Edward under a headstone that read only, "Together at last." Eleanor never visited the grave, but sometimes she sent flowers. Not out of love, out of acknowledgement. They had shared too much history to pretend indifference. In the end, the Belmont lands remained split, north and south, freedom and inheritance, truth and denial, a mirror of the country itself. And long after both women were gone, people would tell their story. Some called it tragedy. Some called it justice. But those who knew better called it what it was. A reckoning. Because freedom, once tasted, can never be forgotten, and guilt, once confessed, can never be undone. The year was 1889, and the air over Natchez hung thick with the smell of magnolia and rain. The world that had once revolved around cotton and bondage was gone, replaced by railroads, telegraphs, and memory. The war had come and gone, leaving behind a country trying to remember who it was before it began lying to itself. And on the northern edge of what had once been Belmont Plantation, an old woman stood on her porch watching the sunset. Her hair had gone silver, her hands trembled slightly as she leaned on her cane. But her eyes, deep, amber, unbroken, were still the same. Eleanor Marie Langford, though she never used the name publicly, had lived to see a world her husband never imagined. The North Tract still belonged to her family. The soil she had once feared to step on as property now stretched quietly around her, 800 acres of green and gold. Her children had all left home, chasing the new century as it rolled toward them. Matthew, her eldest, had become a teacher in Vicksburg, running a school for the children of freedmen. Sarah, graceful and patient, had married a minister and moved to Philadelphia. Thomas, her youngest, had gone north to Ohio, studied law, and returned as one of the first black attorneys to argue before a federal court. They had all written to her that spring, promising to visit. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, Eleanor understood that time was short. Her breath came shallow, now her nights were full of dreams that felt like farewells. Inside, on the small table near her bed, rested a wooden box, weathered, tied with a faded ribbon. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. She had found them 20 years earlier, hidden behind a loose board in her old bedroom wall. Letters written by Edward Langford, the man who had owned her, freed her, and cursed them both with his attempt at redemption. For 2 decades she had not opened them. She told herself she didn't need to. She told herself that reading them would only reopen wounds that had barely scarred over. But now, in the quiet of her final days, she knew she could no longer leave them unread. That evening, as the lamps flickered low, she untied the ribbon and began to read. Eleanor, I tell myself that what we share is love. That because I care for you, because I plan to free you someday, our bond is different from what others have with their slaves. But when I am honest, I know the truth. You cannot refuse me. You cannot leave me. You cannot even tell me what you truly feel. How can that be love? She stopped reading. The words trembled in her hands. And yet I cannot stop coming to you. I am addicted to the lie that you want me, even though I know you cannot freely want anyone who owns you. I am a monster pretending to be a man. I tell myself I will change, but I never do. A tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered into the dark, You did change, Edward. Just too late. The next letter was written in 1853, the year before his death. I have decided to alter my will. Margaret will hate me. My children will curse me. But I cannot die pretending anymore. Perhaps this will make some small measure of amends for what I have done. Freedom given at the end of life is a poor substitute for freedom stolen at the beginning, but it is all I have left to give. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. She could almost hear his voice, that calm, steady tone that had once frightened and comforted her at the same time. For years she had tried to hate him completely. Some days she succeeded. Other days, she remembered the way Head read to their son by lamplight, or how Head brought her books and whispered that she should never stop learning. Love, in their world, had always been a wound. When dawn came, the light spilled across the fields, and Eleanor drifted into sleep. In her dream, she saw the house as it had once been, full of voices, footsteps, laughter, pain. She saw Margaret standing in the parlor, black silk and fury. She saw Edward at his desk, writing furiously by candlelight, coughing into a handkerchief. And then she saw her children, small, bright, and free, running across the same fields that had once enslaved their mother. She woke with tears in her eyes. That afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, a young man stood there, tall, brown-skinned, dressed in a neatly pressed suit. His resemblance to her eldest son was unmistakable. "Grandmama?" he said softly. Eleanor smiled. "Though mass boy." "Yes, Mom. My name's Henry. Father sent me ahead to help with the harvest." She led him in, studying him closely. He had his father's eyes, his grandfather's chin. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite name. Over the following days, Henry worked the fields, repaired fences, carried water, filled the house with a youth it hadn't known in years. At night, he sat by her bedside, listening as she told stories, not just of the trial, but of what came after. He listened silently, sometimes in disbelief, sometimes with awe. When she told him about his great-grandfather's will, he frowned. "He freed you because he felt guilty?" Eleanor nodded. Yes. Guilt is a strange kind of love. Do you forgive him? Henry asked. She stared into the fire. Forgiveness is for the living, she said. Has been dead too long for that. In June, a letter arrived from Sarah in Philadelphia. She wrote that her eldest son had been accepted into university, something unthinkable when she was a girl. She thanked her mother for giving them a name not born in chains. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it beside the others. The legacy shed fought for had finally taken root. Yet part of her still wondered if the cost had been too high. Freedom, she knew now, was not a destination. It was a lifelong negotiation between what you gained and what you lost. That night, she dreamed again. She was young, standing in the parlor of Belmont on that terrible day when the will had been read. The air was thick with silence and fear. Margaret was screaming, Whitfield was trembling, and Edward's ghost stood beside her, whispering, "Tell them I'm sorry." In the dream, she turned to him. "Sorry, isn't enough." When she awoke, dawn was breaking. She felt lighter, as if something inside her had finally been released. Later that morning, Henry came running up the porch steps. "Grandmama, there's someone at the gate." It was a woman, small, white-haired, dressed in plain black. She stood uncertainly, holding a parasol. Eleanor's breath caught. She recognized her instantly. Clara Langford, Margaret's surviving daughter. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other across 35 years of silence. Then Clara spoke. "You're hard to find." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You didn't look very hard." "I wasn't ready," Clara admitted. "Mother passed years ago. We found some of Father's papers after she died. Letters. To you." Eleanor's hands tightened on the porch rail. "I already have some." Clara nodded. "I thought you might. I came to tell you I don't hate you." Eleanor stuttered her. The girl who had once sobbed in the parlor was now a wrinkled woman like herself, carrying her own ghosts. "I don't need your forgiveness," Eleanor said. "It's not forgiveness," Clara replied softly. "It's understanding." For the first time in her life, Eleanor believed her. They sat together on the porch as the sun sank low, talking in quiet voices about their fathers, their mothers, the lives they had both survived. When Clara left at dusk, she took Eleanor's hand and said, "Maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not men making speeches or signing papers, but two women sitting together, telling the truth." Eleanor watched her carriage disappear down the dirt road. She whispered, "Maybe so." That evening, Henry found her sitting by the open window, staring at the horizon. "Tell me again," he said, "what it was like when they read the will." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It was the sound of the world breaking in half," she said, "and the beginning of something that's still being built. Do you think people will remember?" "They'll remember the wrong parts," she said. "They'll remember the scandal, the inheritance, the court. But what mattered was smaller. The moment a woman who had been property heard someone call her miss for the first time." Henry nodded slowly. "That's the part he'll remember." She touched his hand. "Then I've done my job." That night, Eleanor took out one last sheet of paper. Her handwriting had grown shaky, but her words were steady. "To my children and their children, you were born free because a dying man tried to tell the truth. That truth destroyed him, but it saved us. Do not let his name define you. Do not let my pain become your inheritance. Build something better. And when the world forgets who we were, remember this. Freedom is not given, it is claimed. Every day." She signed it simply, E.M., and placed it on top of the letters. Then she lay back against the pillows, listening to the night insects hum outside her window. For the first time in decades, she felt unafraid. When Henry came to check on her at dawn, she was gone. Her face was calm, her hands folded neatly over the letter. He buried her beneath the oak tree overlooking the fields, the same tree where she had once watched her children play, the same place she had first tasted freedom. People came from miles around to the funeral. Freedmen, teachers, ministers, even a few white families from Natchez who had once whispered her name in scandal. Charles Whitfield's son spoke the eulogy. His father had long since passed, but he read from one of Whitfield's journals, found after his death. Eleanor Marie Langford was more than a client. She was the proof that justice can exist even in the smallest cracks of a broken world. When he finished, the crowd stood silent, hats pressed to hearts. Henry placed the box of letters in the earth beside her, sealing the past with her. Years passed. The North Tract became a school, then a meeting place for freed families, then a farm again. Generations of Eleanor's descendants were born there, lived there, buried there. By the turn of the century, the old house had begun to sag, its wood grey with age. But it still stood, proud, defiant, alive. Visitors sometimes came from the north, scholars and journalists who had heard of the woman of Belmont. They expected a tale of romance or tragedy. Instead, they found something harder to define, a story of power, guilt, love, and endurance. One of them, a young writer from New York, wrote afterward, "The Belmont case was not about a man freeing a woman. It was about a woman who refused to let freedom be the end of her story." In time, even the South Tract changed hands. The Langford mansion, long abandoned, was sold to strangers. The two estates, once divided by race and rage, became one again, not by reconciliation, but by history's slow erosion. When Henry's grandchildren inherited the land in the early 1900s, they found the old oak tree still standing, its roots deep, its branches reaching toward both sides of the property. They built a new farmhouse there, and in the parlor they hung a portrait, not of Edward or Margaret, but of Eleanor. In the painting, she stands in sunlight, her grey dress simple, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the fields stretch wide and golden. On the frame, carved in quiet letters, is a single line. She turned chains into roots. And so her story, their story, became part of the soil itself. Every plough that turned that ground, every seed that took root, carried with it the memory of a woman who had once been told she owned nothing, and who proved the world wrong. Time softened the edges of scandal. The names faded, the gossip died, but the land remained, witness to a truth larger than any court or law could contain. Because in the end, the legacy of Belmont was not written in ledgers or wills. It was written in blood and courage, in the stubborn endurance of those who refused to vanish. And if you stand there today, beneath that great oak tree as the evening sun bleeds gold across the fields, you can still feel it, the hum of memory in the earth, the echo of voices long gone but not forgotten. It whispers through the grass, through the dust, through the wind itself. Freedom is not a gift. It is a debt paid forward.